The archive did not scream when it began to die. It simply stopped remembering. Across 1,000,000 worlds, in systems that had never failed in 10,000 years of recorded history, entire civilizations vanished, not physically, not in fire or war, but in something far more terrifying. Records blinked out. Star maps erased themselves. Diplomatic treaties dissolved into empty data fields as if they had never existed. It began quietly, almost politely, as though reality itself were correcting a mistake no one else could see. And then the military fleets started going blind. Weapons systems locked themselves mid-cycle. Targeting arrays froze on coordinates that no longer existed. Entire armadas, poised on the edge of conflict, suddenly found their navigation cores wiped clean of spatial reference. Ships drifted in the void like abandoned relics, their crews fully conscious, fully aware, and utterly powerless to understand why nothing responded to their commands. At first, the Council thought it was sabotage. That assumption lasted exactly 9 minutes. Because in the 10th minute, every screen in every command center, every orbital station, every personal interface across the galaxy flickered to black in perfect unison. Not staggered. Not delayed. Instantaneous. As if some unseen hand had reached into the infrastructure of reality itself and pressed pause. When the screens came back, there was no symbol of war, no emblem of conquest, no threat display. There was only a human. He stood in a dimly lit chamber with no visible technology, no insignia, no sign of authority except the way he looked directly into the lens as if he could see every being watching him. His expression was calm, almost tired, like someone who had repeated the same message too many times and expected it to be ignored again. "We have begun correction." That was all he said at first. No explanation followed, and yet the words carried something heavier than any declaration of war the galaxy had ever heard. Not because they promised destruction, but because they implied it had already started. The feed did not cut. Instead, behind him, the darkness shifted. Stars moved, not exploded, not collapsed. Entire stellar systems sliding into new positions with a precision that defied physics, forming patterns too clean, too deliberate to be natural. It was not chaos. It was design. Controlled. Intentional. Terrifying in its silence. Someone in the council chamber whispered the question that no one wanted to ask out loud. How long has this been happening? No one answered. Because the answer arrived before anyone could speak it. Every system log, every archive trace, every recovered fragment of deleted data began to align into a single, horrifying realization. These corrections were not sudden. They were not new. They had been happening for years. Small adjustments, unnoticed anomalies, dismissed inconsistencies buried under assumptions of error. Human fingerprints. Everywhere. The man on the screen tilted his head slightly, as if hearing the realization spread across the galaxy in real time. "You believed we left," he said quietly. "You believed distance would hide you. That time would outpace us." For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, not anger, not pride, but something colder. "You were wrong." Behind him, the stars shifted again, faster this time, forming a structure so vast that no one in the galaxy could fully comprehend its scale. And then the feed cut to black. For 3 seconds, there was nothing. Then a new message appeared, written in every known language, etched into every active display across the galaxy. Stabilization completes in 71 hours. No explanation. No demands. No negotiation. Just a countdown. And the quiet, suffocating certainty that whatever humanity had become, it had already decided what came next. The first instinct across the galaxy was resistance. Not organized resistance, not yet, but something far more primal, denial disguised as action. Commanders shouted orders into unresponsive systems, technicians tore open consoles that had functioned perfectly hours earlier, and intelligence divisions flooded their networks with emergency protocols that led nowhere. The assumption remained stubbornly alive. This had to be an attack that could be fought, countered, reversed. But the more they tried to act, the more they realized something deeply unsettling. Only certain systems were failing. Civilian networks remained intact. Medical grids continued uninterrupted. Agricultural systems, climate stabilizers, transport lanes, all of them functioned flawlessly, even more efficiently than before. But anything designed for aggression, for expansion, for control, those systems had either frozen or begun rewriting themselves. It was not destruction. It was selection. That realization spread slowly at first, whispered between analysts who did not yet trust their own conclusions. But as reports came in from thousands of worlds, the pattern became undeniable. Entire planetary defense grids had been reduced to inert frameworks, while power distribution systems operated at peak optimization. Orbital weapons arrays sat dormant, yet emergency evacuation channels activated automatically in regions of instability. Someone, or something, was deciding what was allowed to function. And it was not random. Deep within the fractured archives of the Council, a single analyst refused to accept the surface explanation. Her name was Sarah Vallon, a systems historian whose entire career had been spent studying anomalies that others dismissed as statistical noise. She had seen patterns where others saw coincidence, traced inconsistencies that had no clear origin, and built a reputation for asking questions no one else considered worth answering. Now, for the first time, those questions were answering themselves. She sat in a dim chamber surrounded by fragmented data streams, her hands moving across layered projections as she reconstructed what little remained of the erased records. Entire civilizations had vanished from the archives, but not completely. Shadows of them remained, gravitational signatures without names, trade routes leading to nowhere, references in older logs that pointed to entities that no longer officially existed. At first, she thought it was corruption. Then she saw the pattern. Every missing civilization had one thing in common: aggressive expansion curves, militarized growth, historical trajectories that pointed toward large-scale conflict within the next century. They had not been erased physically, only from history. Sarah leaned back slowly, her breath catching as a new possibility formed, a possibility so precise, so deliberate, that it made her hands tremble. "They're not attacking us," she whispered to the empty room. "They're editing us." The implications spread through her mind like a fracture. If humanity had the capability to alter records at this scale, to rewrite the informational backbone of entire civilizations without immediate detection, then this correction was not a sudden act of power. T was the final stage of something much older. Her console flickered. For a brief moment, a string of corrupted data stabilized into a clear sequence, coordinates, timestamps, and a single recurring signature embedded across multiple erased records. She isolated it, expanded it, and felt a cold realization settle into her chest. The signature was human. Not recent. Not new. Centuries old. Sarah's heart began to race as she pulled deeper, linking fragments together, reconstructing a timeline that should not have existed. Human-coded signals appearing at the edges of conflicts long before humanity had the known capacity to reach those systems. Subtle anomalies in war outcomes. Sudden technological leaps in isolated regions with no clear source. Influence. Guidance. Intervention. Always small enough to be ignored. Always precise enough to matter. "They never left," she said aloud, the words feeling heavier the moment they existed. "They just stopped being seen." A sudden pulse of light interrupted her analysis. Across every remaining active system, the human signal returned. This time, it did not take control. It simply appeared. The same man stood in the same dim chamber, unchanged, as if time itself had no authority over him. His gaze was steady, unhurried, almost patient. "You are beginning to notice," he said. There was no arrogance in his tone. No satisfaction. Only acknowledgement, like a teacher observing a student finally reaching the correct conclusion. Sarah's fingers hovered over her console, her instincts screaming to isolate the signal, to trace it, to understand how it was being transmitted. But something stopped her. A realization. If they wanted to hide, they would be hidden. If they were visible now, it was because they allowed it. The man continued. "For 312 of your years, we observed. We measured. We adjusted." The words landed harder than any threat. Not to control you, he added quietly. To prepare you. Across the galaxy, millions watched in silence as those final words echoed through every system. Then the screen shifted. For a fraction of a second, something else appeared behind him. Not stars this time, but structure. Vast, layered, incomprehensible in scale. A network stretching beyond a single galaxy, threaded through empty space like veins carrying something unseen. And then it was gone. The feed ended. The countdown remained. 69 hours. Sarah stared at the fading image, her mind racing not with fear, but with a question that refused to settle. If this was preparation, then what, exactly, were they preparing the galaxy to survive? The answer did not come from the Council. It came from the silence beyond the edge of mapped space. Within hours of the second transmission, long-range observatories began reporting something that should not have been possible. Signals were arriving from regions where there should have been nothing. No stars, no colonies, no known structures. Just the empty, cold dark between galaxies. At first, the data appeared fragmented, almost like background interference, easily dismissed by overwhelmed systems already struggling with human corrections. But then the signals repeated. Identical. Precise. Deliberate. They were not noise. They were a pattern. Sarah Vallon was one of the first to see it clearly. She rerouted every available fragment of long-range telemetry into her chamber, isolating the anomalies and layering them against each other until the distortion resolved into something terrifyingly structured. The signal did not carry language, not in any form the galaxy recognized, but it carried rhythm, perfect, mathematical, almost mechanical in its repetition. The pulse. The pause. A subtraction. Sarah's breath caught as she adjusted the model again, overlaying it with historical archive gaps. The pattern aligned. Exactly. Every erased civilization. Every missing record. Every correction point mapped to the rhythm of that signal. Her hand slowed. They're responding, she whispered, though she was no longer sure to whom. Across the galaxy, ships that had been stranded in system drift began to report something far worse than mechanical failure. Crews were losing memory, not entirely, not all at once, but in fragments. Navigation officers forgot routes they had flown for decades. Engineers stared at consoles they no longer fully understood. Entire segments of shared knowledge began to dissolve, not into confusion, but into absence. Like something had reached inside their minds and removed specific pieces with surgical precision. It was not panic that followed. It was something colder. Recognition. Because the pattern was the same as the archive deletions. Sarah watched the reports flood in, her pulse accelerating as the realization formed fully for the first time. The human corrections had not begun this process. They had been holding it back. The chamber door behind her opened with a sharp hiss, breaking the fragile stillness of her thoughts. A security officer stepped inside, his expression tight, controlled, but edged with something she had never seen in a trained soldier before. Fear without a target. You need to see this, he said, his voice quieter than protocol allowed. Sarah did not argue. Minutes later, she stood in one of the deepest observation halls of the station, surrounded by projections that stretched from floor to ceiling, each one showing a different sector of deep space. The data streams had been synchronized, aligned to track the anomalies as they spread outward from the galactic edge. At first, she saw nothing. Then the stars began to flicker. Not explode. Not collapse. Disappear. Entire points of light vanished from the projections without flare or residue, leaving behind perfect, empty darkness where gravitational readings still insisted something should exist. The instruments did not register destruction. They registered subtraction. The same rhythm she had seen in the signal. Pulse. Fuzz. Subtract. A scientist near the center of the hall spoke, his voice barely audible. We're not losing stars, he said. We're losing the idea of them. The words sounded absurd, until the data confirmed them. Ships sent to verify the disappearing systems reported something even worse. They arrived at coordinates where planets, moons, and stars should have been, and found nothing. Not debris. Not radiation. Not even spatial distortion. Just absence. as if those systems had never formed. Sarah felt her mind push against the implication, trying to reject it, to force it into a model that made sense. But it didn't, because this was not destruction. It was erasure, and it was moving, slowly, methodically, crossing the void between galaxies with a precision that suggested neither randomness nor intent in any form the galaxy understood. It did not rage. It did not accelerate. It simply continued, following its pattern with absolute consistency. The same pattern humanity had been countering for centuries. A new transmission cut through the observation hall without warning. This time, it did not override the systems. It synchronized with them. Every projection dimmed, every data stream paused, and the human figure appeared again, not on a single screen, but layered across the entire room, his presence integrated into the very structure of the data itself. "You see it now," he said. No one spoke. No one moved. Because for the first time, the galaxy understood that this was not a demonstration of power. It was a warning that had arrived too late. Sarah stepped forward before she realized she had made the decision, her voice carrying across the silent hall. "What is it?" The man's gaze shifted, not searching, but precise, locking onto her position as if he had been expecting the question from that exact point in space. For a moment, he did not answer. And in that moment, the stars behind him changed again. Not into order. Not into structure. Into absence. "You do not have a word for it," he said finally. "We did not either. Not at first." The pause followed, longer this time, heavier. "Where it passes, continuity fails," he continued. "Matter is not destroyed. Energy is not released. History is corrected." The word landed with a quiet finality that made every previous human message feel incomplete. Sarah felt her chest tighten. "You've seen this before," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The man inclined his head slightly. "Yes." Another flicker passed through the projections, another star gone, another system erased. "How long?" someone else asked, their voice breaking under the weight of the question. This time, the man did not hesitate. "Long enough to know that you cannot fight it." The statement should have shattered what remained of the galaxy's resistance. Instead, it created something else. A single, fragile thread of understanding. Because if humanity had faced this, and still stood, then the question was no longer whether the galaxy could win. It was whether humanity had already decided who was worth saving. The projection began to fade. But just before it vanished completely, the man spoke again. "We are not your conquerors," he said quietly. The darkness behind him deepened, swallowing the last remaining stars in the frame. "We are your last correction." The transmission ended. The countdown continued. 61 hours. The galaxy did not unify. It fractured. The revelation should have ended debate. It should have collapsed resistance into desperate cooperation, forced even the most arrogant empires into alignment with humanity's plan. Instead, it did the opposite. Fear did not create unity. It created suspicion. Because if something could erase civilizations from existence, then so could the ones claiming to stop it. Across hundreds of worlds, a dangerous question began to spread faster than any signal. What if the humans were not protecting the galaxy? What if they were replacing it? That doubt ignited old instincts. The Kathar Dominion, already humiliated by the loss of their fleets, declared the human transmissions an engineered deception. Their leaders argued that no external threat could possibly exist on such a scale without prior detection, and that the so-called erasure events were nothing more than demonstrations of human technology designed to break resistance before occupation. Others followed. The Vega collectives sealed their systems behind crystalline barriers, refusing all external communication. The swarm hives accelerated their breeding cycles, preparing for a war they could not define. Even smaller civilizations, those that had once trusted in diplomacy, began fortifying themselves against an enemy they no longer understood. And everywhere, the same mistake repeated. They prepared to fight something they could not touch. Sarah Vallon watched it unfold in real time, her chest tightening with each new report. Entire sectors were diverting what little functional infrastructure they had left into defense, overriding the subtle stabilizations humanity had put in place. Power grids that had been optimized for sustainability were forced back into weaponized output. Planetary shields were reactivated, disrupting atmospheric correction systems. Transport lanes were repurposed for military logistics, severing supply chains that had only just begun to stabilize. They were undoing the corrections. Not by force. By fear. "They don't understand," someone said behind her, though there was no anger in the voice, only exhaustion. Sarah did not turn. "No," she replied quietly. "They understand exactly what they're afraid of. Control. Not destruction." That was the difference. The unknown entity erased without intent, without negotiation, without reason. Humanity changed things deliberately, and that made them harder to trust. A sharp alert pulsed across her console, cutting through the noise of incoming reports. New anomaly. Closer. Much closer. Her breath caught as she pulled up the data, isolating the signal pattern that had once been distant, abstract, almost theoretical. Now it was inside the Milky Way. Not deep within it. Not yet. But close enough that its presence distorted long-range sensors, creating blind zones where entire star clusters should have been visible. The pattern remained the same: pulse, pause, subtraction, but the intervals were shortening. It was accelerating. Sarah felt something cold settle into her thoughts as she ran predictive models, forcing the data into timelines that refused to stabilize. At its current rate, the outer sectors would begin to disappear within days. Not years. Not decades. "They're out of time," she whispered. As if summoned by the realization, the human signal returned again. But this time, it did not appear calmly. It forced its way through resistance. Systems that had attempted to block or isolate the transmission were overridden, not violently, but absolutely. Encryption dissolved. Firewalls collapsed. The signal did not break through defenses. It bypassed them. The man appeared once more, but something had changed. The calm was still there, but beneath it was pressure, tightly controlled but unmistakable. "You are interfering with stabilization," he said. No greeting. No explanation. Only a statement of fact. Across the galaxy, leaders bristled at the tone, interpreting it as confirmation of their fears. "You are not authorized to alter our systems," a Qatar representative responded, his voice transmitted through emergency channels, amplified across multiple networks. "Withdraw your influence immediately or—" He never finished the sentence. Not because he was silenced. Because his signal cut out. Not abruptly. Not violently. It simply ceased to exist, leaving behind a blank channel where his presence had been moments before. For a fraction of a second, no one understood what had happened. Then the data updated. The Qatar flagship transmitting the message still existed. Its crew still lived. But the specific transmission, the specific sequence of words, the specific moment of defiance, had been erased, removed from every record simultaneously, as if it had never been spoken. The silence that followed was heavier than any threat. The human on the screen did not react. He simply continued. "This is not control," he said. "This is containment." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, her mind racing as she processed the implications. Humanity was not just countering the external threat. They were preventing the galaxy from accelerating its own destruction. "You are creating instability," the man continued, his gaze sweeping across countless unseen observers. "Aggression amplifies the pattern. Conflict increases exposure. Every system you weaponize becomes a beacon. A beacon for something that erased." The connection snapped into place. War did not just risk destruction. It attracted it. Sarah stepped forward again, her voice cutting through the silence before anyone else could respond. "Then why not tell them sooner?" she demanded. "Why wait until now?" For the first time, the man hesitated. It was brief, barely noticeable, but it was there. "We did," he said. The answer landed like a fracture through the room. "No," Sarah said, shaking her head instinctively. "There's no record." "Because it was erased," he interrupted softly. The words stole the breath from her lungs. Not by humanity. By the entity. Every prior warning. Every earlier attempt. Removed. Cleanly. Completely. Sarah's mind reeled as she understood the full weight of it. Humanity had not been silent for centuries. They had been speaking. And something had been making sure no one remembered. A ripple passed through the projections behind him as another star vanished, closer this time, its absence leaving a wound in the fabric of the visible sky. The man's expression did not change. But his next words carried something new. Not authority. Not warning. Urgency. We are out of time. The transmission flickered, destabilizing for the first time since it had begun. Behind him, the vast structure that had once seemed distant now filled the frame, layers of impossible engineering unfolding, aligning, activating in preparation for something far larger than the galaxy itself. Final stabilization phase will begin at 0, he said. No pause. No reassurance. Those who resist will not survive it. The feed cut. Across every system, the countdown shifted again. 48 hours. And for the first time, even the strongest civilizations in the galaxy began to realize something far more terrifying than defeat. They might not be fighting for victory anymore. They might be fighting for the right to exist at all. The first world vanished without a sound. No alarms triggered. No distress signals were transmitted. No desperate calls for help echoed across the networks. One moment, the system existed, its star burning steadily, its planets orbiting in perfect synchronization, its population engaged in the quiet routines of survival, and the next moment, it did not. Not destroyed. Not shattered. Gone. The absence was so complete that nearby systems did not even register a gravitational shift. Navigation routes that had relied on its mass simply recalculated, adjusting to a universe where that star had never existed. Ships en route to the system continued on their paths, their guidance systems correcting mid-flight, removing the destination without explanation. It took 37 seconds for the galaxy to notice. It took less than 10 for panic to begin. Sarah Vallon watched the data collapse in front of her, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were clearly seeing. She ran the scans again, forced the systems to search for residual traces, radiation echoes, anything that could confirm a catastrophic event. There was nothing. Only clean, perfect absence. Her breath came shallow as she pulled up the system's historical records, desperate to anchor the loss to something tangible, something real. Half the data was gone. Names of species erased. Cultural records fragmented into incomplete sequences. Entire centuries reduced to incoherent references that no longer pointed to anything. It was not just the system that had been removed. It was its memory. A scientist beside her spoke, his voice trembling despite every attempt to remain composed. It's faster now, he said. The pattern, it's accelerating. Sarah didn't respond, because she was no longer looking at the loss. She was looking at the gap. At the precise edge where existence ended and nothing began. And she realized something that made her stomach turn. It was clean. Too clean. No chaos. No instability. No sign of strain or resistance. Whatever this entity was, it did not fight reality. It rewrote it. A surge of light cut through the observation hall as the human transmission forced its way back into every active system, overriding all attempts at isolation. This time, the man did not stand still. He was moving. Behind him, the vast structure that had once been partially obscured now revealed itself in full, layer upon impossible layer of engineered space, not built around a star, but around something far more volatile. At its center, reality itself appeared to bend, not collapsing inward like a black hole, but stretching, stabilizing, held in place by an intricate lattice of energy and matter that defied comprehension. For the first time, the galaxy saw what humanity had been building. Not a weapon. A shield. This is the boundary, the man said, his voice carrying a weight that no longer felt distant or detached. The last one we held. The words settled like ash. We did not conquer Andromeda, he continued. We lost it. Silence followed. Absolute. Even the most defiant minds in the galaxy could not reject what they were seeing. Not anymore. The structure behind him pulsed, and for a fraction of a second, something touched its outer edge. Not a shape, Not a form. Just a distortion. And where it touched, the structure dimmed. Reality flickered. Then stabilized. Sarah felt her pulse hammer in her chest as the truth unfolded with terrifying clarity. "That's not containment," she whispered. "That's defense." The man's gaze shifted again, as if acknowledging her realization without needing to confirm it. "We learned too late," he said. "It does not respond to force. It does not recognize resistance. It does not perceive you as an enemy." Another pulse rippled through the structure, stronger this time, and a section of it failed, vanishing completely before reappearing seconds later as the surrounding systems compensated. "It perceives inconsistency," he continued. "Instability. Contradiction." The implication struck harder than any weapon. Conflict was not just dangerous. It was detectable. "At scale," he added quietly, "you are noise." The galaxy had spent centuries defining itself through power, expansion, and dominance. To this thing, that entire existence was nothing more than a flaw. Sarah stepped forward again, unable to stop herself. "And Andromeda?" she asked. "What happened to it?" For the first time, the man's composure shifted, not breaking, but tightening, as if the answer carried weight he could not fully hide. "We stabilized what we could," he said. "We lost what we couldn't." The structure behind him flared, and the projection expanded outward, revealing something far worse than destruction. Gaps. Entire regions of Andromeda missing, not as ruins, but as perfect voids where stars should have been. Not conquered, consumed. "We adapted," he continued. "We changed how we build, how we think, how we exist." Images flickered across the projection. Human cities spanning entire planets, systems arranged with unnatural precision, energy flows optimized beyond anything the Milky Way had ever achieved. Order. Absolute, uncompromising order. "We removed instability," he said. Sarah's breath caught. "You removed yourselves," she realized. The man did not deny it. Instead, he stepped aside. And for the first time, the galaxy saw humanity as it existed now, not as scattered colonies, not as evolving civilizations, but as something unified, coordinated, functioning with a level of precision that bordered on the impossible. Trillions of humans. Moving. Working. Thinking. As one system. Not controlled. Aligned. A civilization that had chosen survival over individuality when the cost became clear. "We did what was necessary," he said. The words carried no pride. Only certainty. Sarah felt a cold realization settle into her mind, one that redefined everything humanity had said so far. "You're not preparing us to fight it," she said slowly. The man looked directly at her. "No," he replied. The answer came without hesitation. "We are preparing you to survive it." The structure behind him pulsed again, harder, brighter, as if something on the other side had noticed. The projection destabilized for a fraction of a second, and in that instant, the galaxy glimpsed something impossible. Not a form, not a presence, but a gap. A hole in existence that did not belong. Then the image snapped back into place. The man's expression hardened, just slightly. "Your galaxy is next." The transmission cut. The countdown shifted. 36 hours. And for the first time, the galaxy understood that this was not a warning about conquest. It was a countdown to something that had already arrived. The galaxy did not have 36 hours. It had less. No one said it out loud at first, but the data made it undeniable. The entity's pattern, once distant, predictable, almost theoretical, was no longer stable. It was changing, adapting, compressing its intervals in response to something the galaxy itself was doing, or had already done. Entire sectors began to flicker, not vanishing instantly, but destabilizing in ways that defied every known model of physics. Stars dimmed without losing mass. Planets drifted out of orbit for fractions of a second before snapping back into place. Communication signals looped backward in time, repeating transmissions that had not yet been sent. Reality was stuttering, and every instance of large-scale conflict made it worse. Sarah Vallon stood at the center of the observation hall, watching as predictive simulations collapsed one after another, unable to keep pace with the accelerating pattern. The projections no longer displayed future outcomes, they displayed failure states. Every path that involved resistance ended the same way. Erasure. Not delayed. Not mitigated. Inevitable. "They're feeding it," she said, her voice low but steady. No one asked what she meant. Because they already knew. Every warship powering up its weapons. Every defensive grid pushing beyond its optimal thresholds. Every act of defiance rooted in aggression or fear. It all created the same effect. Signal amplification. The galaxy was lighting itself up like a beacon. And something beyond the edge of existence was responding. A new wave of reports flooded in. Outer colonies gone. Not destroyed, removed. Navigation routes recalculated again, adjusting to a universe that had never contained those systems. Crews reported disorientation not from shock, but from absence. They could not remember what had been there. Only that something should have been. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to think past the fear. "This is why they're taking control," she said. "Not to rule us, to silence us." The words felt wrong. And yet they fit. Humanity was not escalating. It was suppressing. Limiting output. Reducing variability. Compressing the chaotic signals of 1,000 civilizations into something quieter. Something stable. Something that would not attract attention. The realization hit her harder than any revelation so far. Humanity was not trying to win. It was trying not to be noticed. A surge of energy rippled through the station, pulling her back into the present. Lights dimmed. Systems recalibrated. The very structure beneath her feet seemed to shift, as if responding to an external force pressing against the edges of reality. The human signal returned. Not cleanly this time. Fragments of it forced their way through disrupted channels, assembling piece by piece until the familiar figure stood before them again. But the clarity was gone. Static bled through the image. The background flickered between structure and void. Even their transmission was under pressure. "We are initiating full stabilization," the man said. His voice carried strain now, not emotional, but structural, as if the medium itself resisted the message. "Your current state is unsustainable." Across the galaxy, leaders attempted to respond, to argue, to negotiate. Most of them failed. Their systems no longer prioritized their commands. Human overrides were no longer selective. They were absolute. Entire planetary grids shut down mid-cycle, their outputs rerouted into patterns no local authority could override. Weapons systems powered down permanently. Shield networks reconfigured into atmospheric stabilizers. Fleet navigation cores locked onto predetermined coordinates, redirecting ships away from conflict zones whether their crews agreed or not. It was no longer subtle. It was forced. "This is not your decision anymore," the man continued. For the first time, the statement sounded like control. Not because it was harsh. Because it was final. Sarah stepped forward, ignoring the warnings flashing across her console. "You said you weren't here to control us," she said, her voice cutting through the instability. "You said this was preparation." The man looked at her, and for a moment, the static cleared just enough for something human to show through. "Regret." "It was," he replied. The word lingered. "Now it is survival." Behind him, the structure flared again, brighter, more unstable. Entire sections flickered out of existence before snapping back into place, each recovery slower than the last. Something was pushing through. Not fully. Not yet. But enough. Sarah felt it before she saw it. A pressure that had no direction, no source, just presence. The projections around her began to distort, not losing data, but losing meaning. Coordinates no longer aligned. Time stamps contradicted themselves. Cause and effect fractured into overlapping sequences that refused to resolve. Then a section of the hall went dark. Not the lights. The space. For a fraction of a second, it simply wasn't there. The people standing within it reappeared an instant later, disoriented but alive, their memories intact. Barely. A scientist collapsed to his knees, gasping. "I forgot my own name," he whispered. Silence followed. heavy. Absolute. The man on the screen did not react. We cannot hold the boundary indefinitely, he said. There was no hesitation left in his voice now. No room for interpretation. You will undergo correction. The words spread across the galaxy with the weight of inevitability. Not a threat. The process. Sarah's mind raced, trying to find a path, a variable, anything that could change the outcome she was seeing unfold in real time. There has to be another way, she said. The man's gaze softened, just slightly. There was, he replied. Past tense. The structure behind him pulsed again, harder, closer to collapse, and this time, the distortion did not remain contained. It spread, bleeding into the edges of the projection, into the signal itself. For a fraction of a second, the galaxy saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. A void that did not belong. A presence defined only by the absence it created. Then it was gone. The signal stabilized. Barely. 31 hours, the man said. The countdown updated instantly. 31 hours. And for the first time, the galaxy understood that humanity was no longer asking for cooperation. They were enforcing silence, before something worse learned how to listen. The galaxy did not go quiet all at once. It fought the silence. Not with weapons, not anymore, but with something deeper, more instinctive. Cultures that had defined themselves through voice, expression, expansion, began to resist in the only way they had left. They transmitted. They broadcast. They spoke into the void, flooding every channel with identity, history, proof that they existed. It was defiance. And it was exactly what would kill them. Sarah Vallon watched the surge of transmissions spike across the network, her heart sinking as the data visualizations transformed into something she had never seen before. The galaxy lit up, not with war signals, but with life itself, amplified to a level that pushed every system beyond equilibrium. Billions of voices. Simultaneous. Uncoordinated. Beautiful. Fatal. The pattern responded instantly. From the outer edges of the Milky Way, the rhythm accelerated beyond prediction. Pulse. Fuzz. Subtract. Entire clusters dimmed, then vanished, not gradually, but in cascading sequences, as if the entity had finally found something worth focusing on. Stop them, Sarah whispered, though she knew no one could. Human systems tried. Across thousands of worlds, the forced stabilizations intensified. Communication networks were dampened, throttled, redirected into controlled channels. Planetary systems were locked into strict output limits. Energy flows were rerouted, compressing the chaotic signals of civilization into narrow, uniform bands. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Because resistance had changed. It was no longer organized. It was emotional. Fear had turned into expression, and expression into noise. And the entity was listening. The human signal forced its way through once more, fracturing and reforming as the surrounding space distorted under increasing pressure. The man appeared again, but this time, the illusion of distance was gone. He was closer. Not physically, but in presence, in urgency, in the way his voice carried a weight that pressed into the minds of every being watching. You must stop, he said. No introduction. No explanation. Just necessity. They will not, Sarah replied, stepping forward instinctively, her voice breaking through the chaos of overlapping transmissions. They don't understand what silence costs. For a moment, the man said nothing. And in that silence, another sector vanished. Closer this time. Too close. They understand, he said finally. They refuse. The words struck harder than any accusation. Because they were true. Across the galaxy, civilizations were choosing identity over survival, expression over existence, unable, or unwilling, to accept that the very things that defined them were the same things that would draw the entity closer. Sarah felt something shift inside her, something that had been building since the first transmission. A question. One she had avoided asking. Until now. What happens at zero? She asked. The man looked at her, and for the first time, there was no hesitation, no measured response. Only truth. We complete the correction. Her breath caught. "And what does that mean?" she pressed. Behind him, the structure flared violently, entire sections collapsing and reforming in rapid succession as the pressure against it intensified. The distortion was no longer contained. It bled into the edges of the projection, warping the very signal that carried his image. "It means," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos, "we remove what attracts it." The implication hit like a shockwave. Sarah's mind raced, rejecting the conclusion even as it formed. "You mean the systems?" she said quickly. "The weapons, the networks, the—" "No." The single word cut through her. "Final. We remove instability." The room fell into a silence more complete than anything that had come before. Because for the first time, the galaxy understood what humanity had been avoiding saying. Not systems. Not structures. People. Not all. But enough. Sarah stepped back, her thoughts spiraling as the weight of it settled in. "You're deciding who survives," she said. The man did not deny it. "We are deciding what survives," he corrected. Another ripple tore through the observation hall. This time, the distortion did not vanish immediately. A section of space remained wrong, flickering between existence and absence, as if reality itself could not decide whether it belonged. A technician screamed, then stopped. Not because he had been silenced. Because the moment itself had been removed. Sarah's hands clenched as she forced herself to stay focused, to think through the fear. "There has to be another way," she said again, more urgently now. "You adapted once. You found a way to survive in Andromeda. You can do it again without—" "Without change," the man interrupted. For the first time, something sharp entered his tone. "We tried." The words carried a depth of history that the galaxy could not fully comprehend. "We preserved individuality, diversity, conflict. We believed we could balance it." The structure behind him flared again, and this time, the image shifted, not intentionally, but under strain. For a fraction of a second, Sarah saw something else. Not the present, the past. A glimpse of Andromeda before the correction. Stars misaligned. Systems chaotic. Signals overlapping in uncontrolled bursts. And then, gaps. Entire regions gone. The image snapped back. "We failed," he said. The simplicity of it made it worse. Another pulse. Closer. The distortion spread further, creeping into the core systems of the galaxy itself. Entire data streams collapsed, replaced by blank fields that no longer held meaning. Coordinates broke down. Names lost context. History began to fracture in real time. Sarah felt it happening, not just in the systems, but in her own thoughts. Concepts slipping, connections weakening, as if something was reaching inward, testing the edges of her existence. "How much time?" she asked, forcing the question through the rising pressure. The man didn't look away this time. He didn't soften the answer. "Less than you think." The countdown updated again. 12 hours. And for the first time since the transmissions began, the number did not feel like a warning. It felt like a deadline for a decision no one was ready to make. The galaxy did not choose. It broke. 12 hours was not enough time for consensus, not enough time to overcome centuries of identity, pride, fear, and history. Civilizations argued until their signals collapsed. Leaders issued commands that were overwritten before they could be completed. Entire populations waited, not in unity, but in paralysis, caught between a future they did not understand and a past they refused to abandon. And as they hesitated, the entity advanced. It did not rush. It did not need to. From the outer rim inward, reality began to fail in expanding waves. Entire constellations flickered like dying lights, their existence thinning, unraveling into nothingness without resistance. Ships caught in those regions did not explode or vanish in fire. They simply ceased to have ever been there, their absence propagating backward through records, memories, and cause itself. The galaxy was not being destroyed. It was being rewritten. Sarah Valens stood at the center of the observation hall as the projections collapsed into incomprehensible fragments. Systems could no longer track what was happening because the data itself could not remain consistent long enough to be observed. Every model failed. Except one. the human model. Her hands trembled as she brought it up, overlaying the projected path of the entity against the structure humanity had built across Andromeda and beyond. For the first time, she saw it not as a shield, but as a system. A network designed to enforce a single principle across an entire galaxy. Stability. Silence. Consistency. She understood then. Not emotionally. Not philosophically. Mathematically. The entity did not destroy complexity. It removed contradiction. Anything that could not resolve into a stable, predictable pattern was corrected. And humanity had learned to become something that could not be corrected. A civilization that had aligned itself so completely that it no longer produced the kind of noise the entity detected. They had not just survived. They had adapted to the rules of existence itself. The human signal returned one final time. It did not override the systems. It did not need to, because there were no systems left to resist it. The man stood there again, but the illusion of distance was gone entirely now. The distortion pressed in around him, bleeding into the frame, testing the edges of the structure behind him. This is the final phase, he said. No introduction. No hesitation. Only truth. We cannot delay further. Across the galaxy, what remained of its civilizations watched in silence, not forced this time, but chosen. Not because they had agreed. Because they had seen enough to understand. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite everything unraveling around her. How many? She asked. The man met her gaze. Less than before, he said quietly. Not an answer, but enough. Her breath caught as the weight of it settled in. Not total annihilation. Not extinction. Selection. She closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to think past fear, past morality, past everything that made this impossible to accept, and found the truth waiting beneath it. If we don't change, she said slowly, we all disappear. The man did not respond. He didn't need to. Sarah turned, looking out across the fractured projections of a dying galaxy, worlds flickering, signals collapsing, existence itself slipping through the cracks of something far beyond comprehension. Then she made the decision no one else had. Do it, she said. The words felt heavier than anything she had ever spoken. But they were clear. And for the first time, they were enough. The man closed his eyes briefly, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement. Correction begins. The structure behind him ignited. Not in fire. In order. Across the galaxy, the human network activated in full, spreading outward in waves of impossible precision. Systems locked into alignment. Energy flows stabilized. Signals compressed into narrow, uniform patterns that stripped away chaos without destroying function. And then, it reached the civilizations. Not violently, not destructively, but absolutely. Worlds went silent. Not dead. Still alive. But changed. Communication reduced to essential pathways. Systems restructured to eliminate conflict. Entire infrastructures rewritten in moments, transforming chaotic, unpredictable civilizations into stable, self-contained systems that no longer broadcast instability into the void. It was not conquest. It was transformation. And for those who resist it, the process did not complete. They flickered, hesitated, and then they were gone. Final. As if they had never existed. Sarah felt the wave reach her system, her body tensing as the station around her shifted, systems rewriting themselves in real time. For a moment, panic surged through her, instinct screaming against the loss of control. Then it passed. Her thoughts sharpened. Not diminished. Focused. The noise was gone. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She looked up. The projections stabilized. The stars. For the first time since the beginning, the pattern stopped advancing. Not because it had been destroyed, but because it no longer had anything to correct. The entity lingered at the edge of the galaxy, its presence pressing against the boundary, searching, testing, finding nothing. And then, it moved on. Not defeated. Not destroyed. Just uninterested. The silence that followed was not empty. It was safe. Sarah exhaled slowly, her gaze lifting to the stabilized sky as systems across the galaxy came back online. Not as they had been, but as something new. Ordered. Connected. Alive. The human signal remained for a moment longer. The man looked out across what the galaxy had become, his expression unchanged, but his voice carrying something new. Not authority. Not warning. Relief. It is done, he said. No celebration followed. No triumph. Because the cost was understood. Not in numbers, but in absence. Sarah stepped forward one last time, her voice quiet. Was this the only way? The man did not answer immediately. For a moment, the silence stretched, filled with everything that had been lost and everything that remained. Then finally, yes. The transmission faded. The structure dimmed. And across the galaxy, a new reality settled into place. Not the one they had chosen, but the one they had survived. For the first time in centuries, the stars did not flicker. They remained, steady, quiet, and far beyond them, in the cold dark between galaxies, something ancient and unknowable continued its path, searching for noise in a universe that had finally learned how to be silent.